We'll be hearing from the leaders of the four largest British parties in the Parliament, assessing the events of the past year and looking ahead to 2011 as well. Well, I'm joined by those four leaders. We have Martin Callanan, who was recently elected to lead the British Conservatives at the European Parliament. We have Glenis Willmott, who leads the Labour MEPs here. We have Fiona Hall, who is leader of the British Liberal Democrats, and Nigel Farage, who leads the UK Independence MEPs. Thanks all of you for joining me. Are you one of those that privately thinks that your Prime Minister went too far in accepting, for example, legislation on hedge fund managers, on financial supervisory bodies, even buckling and deserting that position for a freeze on the EU budget?
Well, on most of those issues, of course, he had no choice because power has already been given away by Labour and by others in the past. These are all subject to qualified majority voting. All David Cameron could do was try to win friends, influence people and win the best deal for Britain in an admittedly bad lot, and I think he's done a very good job at that. On the budget, we would all have liked to have seen a budget freeze or ideally some budget reductions, but again, under Lisbon and previous treaties, this is now subject to qualified majority voting. He no longer has a veto, so he has no choice legally. The best that he can do is to win enough support, and he's done that, and he managed to get an increase of 2.91%. I would have preferred a freeze or indeed a reduction, but that wasn't simply an option that was on offer.
Nigel Farage, do you agree with that reading?
Not a bit, no. Actually, this government has been really very enthusiastic for European integration. I mean, not only did this government accept the European External Action Service, but William Hague now goes around publicly eulogising about the need for the European Union to have a big, strong foreign policy. Now, that is a very big policy change. Similarly, with upgrades to the European arrest warrant, we saw Theresa May, the Home Secretary, quite enthusiastically telling the House of Commons that this was the next logical step to take. So, to make the argument that they just inherited all of this from the last Labour government is nonsense, and one thing you can say for certain is that Hague and Cameron are very popular in the European Union because they're just as integrationist, if not more so, than the previous Labour government.
We are constantly building coalitions across all of the different groups. Often all the UK parties will vote together across the spectrum on an issue that's important to the UK. Often we work with Liberals, sometimes with Socialists, sometimes with Nigel's grouping, and to get agreement on any particular piece of legislation, or ideally to stop a piece of legislation, you have to build a coalition across the Parliament. So, you know, we talk to politicians across the whole spectrum. Everybody does, because it's the way the place works.
You cannot argue that you're against integration when actively in that chamber your MEPs vote for integration every single time. And in particular, can I talk about the fact that since this coalition government came to power, we have agreed, we've signed on the dotted line for Britain's biggest industry, financial services, to now be 100% regulated by 3 new European authorities. That is one of the biggest economic integrationist moves we've seen since we joined the common market, and your party has enthusiastically supported it at every stage.
We did not enthusiastically support it.
You voted for it, you've supported it.
We did not. We went in there.
You voted for motions calling for directives
we had no choice but to negotiate on the subject, because, again, it was subject to qualified majority voting, which is true.
That's at the Council of Ministers. Forget that.
It's subject to...
Forget the red herring.
But the problem is that your own backbenchers, though, I mean, obviously the UK Independence Party is going to attack. One area, though, where we're talking about, you know, splits or whatever, but one area where you all were fairly solid as British parties was on the budget, which, of course, got agreed in this last session. But I gather that 3 of you voted against, 1 of you voted for. How big an issue do you think this was, and how do you think it's going to develop in the next year, Nigel?
Well, I mean, look, the form is, it doesn't actually matter how British MEPs vote on any issue because we can be outvoted, and here's another classic example. I think the fact is that at a time of austerity, at a time when the public across every country in Europe are perceiving cuts and rising unemployment, these institutions, with their own very, very dodgy accounts, which for the last 16 years have been queried by the auditors, once again are increasing the budget. It's gone up by 3%. I know some wanted it to be 6%, but, you know, this juggernaut just keeps on rolling. And I think money, the currency partly, but the sheer cost of the European Union is going to become a much bigger issue in British politics over the next 5 years, because we're going to see issues like the rebate, which Mr. Blair signed away, really beginning to kick in.
Slightly larger picture, because this has been a massively tumultuous year for the EU. I mean, it's questioned the very principles about the whole thing.
Yeah.
National interests have risen to the fore. At the same time, though, you've had big European solutions being pushed harder as well. Very odd kind of...
Yeah, there's a real dichotomy here, isn't there? I mean, you know, this Parliament, all the EU institutions are trying to use the crisis that's been caused around the euro as a reason to gain more power and more centralisation. But I think...
But you're trying to use the crisis, too, as a reason to destroy the whole thing, aren't you?
I think, you know, to a large extent, this euro crisis is something that we predicted over 10 years ago. So, I think we're playing this with a very straight bat. But I do think what's happened in 2010 is in every single European country, what you've seen is a genuine rise in Euroscepticism. Not just about the euro, but about the whole European project. And what legitimacy does it have when nobody has actually voted for this in free and fair referendums?
But I think what we have also learnt in the process is that we are not an island in the UK in economic terms, and we may not be in the euro, but our banks are very involved and intertwined with the financial affairs in Ireland. And so what the stability of the eurozone, whether Nigel likes it or not politically, is actually important for the UK as well.
But I don't think it's going to work for you, because actually what we're doing by appearing to help countries like Ireland and Greece, we're actually keeping them trapped for longer inside a system from which inevitably they're going to break out. This can't work. The North and South in Europe cannot be together in one monetary union. That's pragmatism.
We're not. You know, what happens in the Eurozone has a massive effect, and that's why the government is doing what they can to help Ireland. I mean, there's no doubt they're bailing Ireland out. And that's because it's so important to us. And whatever you say, whether you're in or out of the Eurozone, you know, look at the amount of trade we have within the Eurozone. It's too important to fail. It's too important to fail. For us, even though we're not in the Eurozone, we have to...
It's going to fail, Glenys. Ireland cannot stay in the euro. It won't be in the euro in 5 years' time, and we will have poured £7 billion, good money after bad.
Now the Parliament has a say. The Citizens' Initiative that we voted on this week, people coming forward directly in order to ask for legislation.
Nigel is laughing.
A Citizens' Initiative, and we sell this to the European public, that if 1 million people sign a petition, that the European Commission will consider bringing a law in and having a big debate about it, unless, of course, that the initiative proposes reductions of the powers of the EU, and if that happens, it's put in the bin. It's not worth the paper it's written on. It's absolute nonsense.
With you, Nigel, and very briefly, what has been the defining moment of the year for you?
There was a moment at the end of September when 100,000 trade unionists were marching through Brussels and forming up in Place Luxembourg outside the Parliament, complaining at the austerity cuts that were being brought in and forced upon member states. And at that very moment, the Budget Committee voted for an 85% increase in the MEPs' entertaining allowance. I think that sums up this massive divide that's got wider in 2010 between what ordinary people want and what this political class in these institutions want. And as somebody that wants Britain to withdraw from the European Union, 2010 has been a good year. To find out more about who we are and what we stand for, go to the UK Independence Party website at www.ukip.org.